ask you a question about. Yeah, sorry, my name is JD. I am doing a PhD in history myself. So, anyway, I wanted to ask you a question regarding what you said here about the cultural turn in the 70s specifically. It's very interesting for me to, when you put it that way, to notice how there has been a lot of sympathy extended to other non-Western cultures, be it Native Americans, be it Africans, be it even, the Arabs. And it is very difficult to criticize these in academia. These are, academic holy cows in some way. However, that sympathy does not seem to exist as much with Hinduism. I don't know if this is just my being overly sensitive, or do you also see that? And why do you think this is, if it is the case?
You're absolutely right. I was obviously drawn to these newer academic traditions, like critical cultural studies, because they reflected, they not just reflected, but they, I guess, sparked in me a way of looking at the world and recognizing a lot of things are wrong in it, that there has been oppression, injustice, violence, cruelty, all these things. And it was just that all these things have happened to us too. And not to just make a pointless grievance about it, but just, I do think that it has just become insane in that there is an enormous reality in history, in social reality, in the world, call it what you will, which has simply not been recognized in academia. Now, why has this happened? So I agree, it's there. There's a blind spot in the field. In fact, it's so blind, as Chatterjee said, it's almost like I'm tempted to wonder whether I've just been living in a schizophrenic cult all these years. But anyway, the good thing about academic freedom and undergrad education is I do get enough liberty to engage my students and, talk about some of these things. But at a more canonical level, where knowledge is produced, the academic conferences, AAR and the history conferences and things like that, that's where I think there's a lot of vested interests, which have become very, very dogmatic about engaging with some of our criticisms. Why did it happen? I can think of 2 or 3 things which are probably anecdotal or circumstantial. One, maybe we did not have the numbers in academia, and we still don't, in any large measure. Most of us became engineers and doctors. And by the way, my child policy advocacy, I think some of you may have read it. I'm not, okay, so I'm like some of our leaders, I too am going around making some suggestions about Hindus and children, though mine is a qualitative rather than mine, okay. Yeah, so qualitative rather than a quantitative one. My suggestion is simple, those of you who haven't seen this yet. In the old days, in families, many children used to stay back, work the farm, look after parents, and maybe one son would go join the army, right, to protect the kingdom. Today, we need something like that. So if you have more than one child can be an engineer or medicine, that's fine, or MBA, whatever. Send the other child into humanities and social sciences. Now, in the 70s, it wasn't there, we didn't have the numbers, and the few of us who did go out into academia at that time, I think somehow, never really spoke up for us. I don't know why. Maybe it was a product of the deeply elitist and one-sided Nehruvian intellectual worldview that we lived with from independence onwards. So essentially, it was like a dialogue between, I guess, the post-colonial schizophrenics and our domestic, elites. And between that, somehow it never really happened. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that by raising these questions intelligently, professionally, we can slowly change the discourse. Because one of the most appalling things that happened to me, or rather that happened to all of us really, was having to live with some of the circus that came out when Wendy Doniger's book was challenged last year. I remember particularly Stephen Prothero's article in USA Today, where he called Wendy Doniger Sojourner Truth, the voice of liberal Hindus. Okay, so I suddenly said, okay, but Wendy Doniger, who doesn't understand a word of Hinduism, or reproduces this flawed colonial Orientalist premise in the name of, recuperating subaltern voices and stuff like that, is the voice of liberal Hindus. I mean, there are 1 billion liberal Hindus in the world. And where are we? Where are we in the bookshops of America? We are not. I mean, you go to any bookshop anywhere in the world, you're going to see, at best you'll see Gandhi and Yogananda, I'm glad. Otherwise, you're going to see Doniger and other people like that. So it's cultural imperialism, those of you who read a bit of media critique, you'll be aware. Essentially, the so-called critique, subaltern critique that Doniger is making is really cultural imperialism. And that's what I think we are challenging, and I'd love to stay in touch with you and hope you'll be able to tell a better history.
A very nice book. I just glanced through it, and I'd like to congratulate you and thank you for this. Two-part question. One is, of course, something which Dr. Chaitra had brought out. Two types of colonialism that we have kind of experienced: the Islamic and then the imperial British. Isn't there a third colonialism that has really disrupted the past 60 years, where we kind of made to think along these socialistic, secularized lines, which does not allow our children to grow up into individuals who can really think independently, to challenge these kinds of impositions? And the second part of the same question is, if Donnie Wendiger can write an alternative history of Hinduism, why is it that academics like you not produce alternative history textbook from class 1 of CBSE or ICSE or NCERT till class 12, and say that people can of course download it on their own and read it through just to get a hang of what is the thinking otherwise? Why could that not be done?
Thank you. A very good question. Part one, yes, the third colonialism is a very apt way of put it. I mean, and again, as Dr. Chaitra put it, I mean, secularism in India was essentially colonialism, continued in many fashions. And it's amazing, even to somebody like me who was, really upset about Hindu misrepresentations. Now, my field talks about misrepresentation of every subject. If you go to the annual media studies conferences, you'll find a special group on Arab American media, Jewish media, gay and lesbian media. A lot of papers, a lot of books being done on how all these groups are being misrepresented by the media and how the media can do better. There is no such group for us. There isn't even an India misrepresentation group or whatever. If there is an India, or rather, South Asia, there is probably a South Asia group. And usually what South Asia groups is turn around and talk about how, the Indian media is pro-Hindu and oppressing the minorities. Okay, so that's consensus. By the way, let me give you an even more absurd example. I mentioned it in my book. I was reviewing a book, a fairly nice academic book a couple of years ago, and it was actually critical of the famed IWE, or whatever it's called, the Indian writers in English. Not the Indian, mainly the 4 or 5 people who are well known in the West, like Arundhati Roy, Pankaj Mishra, and all these people. It was a good book. I was impressed that there were some critical scholars who were pointing out this phenomenon, this Orientalism and cultural imperialism, and the select few of literary superstars that the Anglo-American publishing industry has elevated to sainthood. And there was a chapter in there about Slumdog Millionaire, and I read it very excitedly. And the chapter was basically very critical about how the movie Slumdog Millionaire enforces Hindu normativity. Did we all watch even the same movie? I mean, here's a movie which deliberately changes the principal character's name. I mean, in the novel he was an everyman. You can have critique in India. I think self-critique in India is very, very important. But, the Bollywood strategy is the best. Go with Amar Akbar Anthony, the old Bollywood. This new PK Bollywood, I don't know. Again, there is too much identity politics coming down and distorting things. But at least, there was something like that. Now, the Slumdog Millionaire brazenly and blatantly set up this identity politics calculus. Now remember 2008, the most popular movie, the runaway success movie, essentially creates this narrative about the Hindu oppression of Muslims in India, in Slumdog Millionaire. Virtually the same time, a gang of terrorists comes into Bombay and kills hundreds of people and literally terrorizes, a largely cosmopolitan, peace-loving, fun-loving city. And the aforesaid, literally elite writers hit the New York Times and the Guardian, and they're telling us about how it's the Hindu oppression of Muslims, it's India's oppression of Kashmir that is responsible for this. And they're also telling us, essentially, that this was social justice. That poor Muslims are fighting back against rich Hindus.
Wow.
I'm simplifying a bit, but that's what the left-wing intellectual consensus about the Bombay terrorism attacks was. So, so that's how absurd, things are in academia. Now, as for and unfortunately, to get back to your question, I'm sorry. It's one thing to live in the US for me to observe all this and say this. But in the last 2 weeks that I've been in India, on one hand, I have been so enthused by conversations like this, to find so many friends, passionate and dedicated about this. But occasionally I do run into some of my friends who ask me the most bizarre questions, and I know who is living in a bubble now. Nobody in this room is living in a bubble, okay? Whoever is disagreeing with us, frankly, is living in a bubble. I'm so clear about that now. Unfortunately, they have the TV channels and the newspapers and the ear of the elites. But I hope we can change it. I really hope we'll poke a hole in the bubble so much that their own echoes get nauseating for them, and they'll beg to run out of it. That's the strategy.
I have read your book, I'm sorry, but I heard you say that it's time for some action, and that's what I'd like to focus my question on. There are lots of little initiatives going on now, thanks to the change in government, and to some extent in this country we are heavily dependent on the patronage of the government, which is why for 60 years we never got where we did. But now everybody is saying, use the time we have. Unfortunately, 1 year is gone, we've only got 4 years, and maybe with some luck we'll get a little bit longer. So my question to you is that how do we as little groups all over coordinate in such a way that we have some influence? Because we can have these talks, we can have a book here and there, and you're already saying that the media is not necessarily mainstreaming any of this. So what do we do?
Thank you. Just keep connecting, keep engaging, keep talking, and to use a rather lefty hippie expression, feel the love. Because these guys have portrayed us out to be some hateful, crazy monsters, and we are not. I mean, we're just ordinary people. After my Delhi event, somebody, my friends commented and said, I've never seen a crowd like this at India International Center. It was so genuine, humble, respectful, there because of love for what was being discussed and not for some, pseudo social appearances. So what we have is honesty, and I think it's a good thing, and connecting and doing all this is fine. Now in terms of gathering influence, and that also goes back to Mohanji, your comment about, why can't I write my own alternative history book? I would love to if I had, when we form the critical mass, I think we can do it. Now this is a challenge. 1 year has gone by, and 1 year, rightly or wrongly, the only things we heard about in this historic opportunity was Pushpak Viman. And whether the mocking of it was exaggerated, I'm sure it was. The fact is, there is a real need for us to tell our friends in the government that intellectual work is not like buying an ad or putting up an election hoarding, right? It is very, very different because it involves argument. We cannot fully de-link and create our own alternative universe. Okay? At some point, whatever alternative universes, the small groups, the websites, the blogs, we are all doing, the wonderful stuff that's going on with India Facts and Swarajya and all these things that are going on. I mean, in the alternative media. I mean, that is real alternative media, if you ask me. By the way, somebody asked, why I'm associating with an anti-Christian blog or something, and I just said, we are anti-untruth. I don't think we are anti any community. That's the way I see it. I got into this game because in my professional dharma is to critique untruth in the media, and my guru and my father and the way I have understood it, I find untruth to be the source of many, many evils in the world. Not capitalism or communalism or nothing, it's just untruth. Where there is respect for truth, all non-violence follows, all beautiful things follow. Anyway, so we need to engage intellectually. I think the powers that we need to recognize that this is not just about printing some other textbook with whatever stuff we want and expecting it to change minds and argument. No, the children are smarter than that. The establishment is entrenched. And there are a lot of people sitting in the middle. There's a lot of people who are probably beginning to see, the wisdom of what we are saying, but also, don't want to accept it just yet. I mean, I'm sure it's a tough thing for a lot of people to accept their whole lives have been wrong. So they'll figure out their own exits and their own cushy retirements. That's up to them. We want the future. They've had the past. They've had much of our present. We want, let's have the future. Now, influence. Okay, very key point. I think, and this is something I honestly really came to recognize. I don't know who finally, or maybe it was Vibhishana who told Rama where, the arrow had to be aimed at Ravana. I only came to recognize in the last couple of months after meeting a lot of friends in connection with this book in LA and elsewhere. I think the single source of change we must focus on is academia, and for me, and I would say particularly American academia. For this reason, very simple. We don't realize that the narrative, there is a factory for narratives in the world, and it is the US academia. Because it comes from there, it comes to the JNUs and all the other places in India through academics. It filters down, through the school level. 2 days ago I was in Hyderabad, a friend kind of roped me in for a last minute private gathering, and he told me an amazing story. For once I was happy the drive was long from the airport to Hyderabad, because it was an appalling story. Apparently he got into this issue because his two daughters, were going to a very nice school in Hyderabad, which is known for being culturally respectful, and it's a wonderful school. And he discovered the school was essentially teaching these crazy lessons on how barbaric and hierarchical and oppressive Hindu history was. And when he went to talk to them like a concerned parent, they all climbed upon him. These wonderful people apparently told him, like, if you don't like this, withdraw your children from school. And now these are the stories I've been hearing in California from dozens of people. That's why so many people have been struggling for several years to get the California textbooks changed. A minimum courtesy that was extended to all other communities in the post-racial world, right? I mean, the lessons about Islam were changed peacefully, the lessons about Jews were changed peacefully. Finally, when we noticed and said, oh, why do we have to swallow this racist garbage? They all came down on 100 people came down on us, including some of my former professors. So I was very scared to speak out because I thought we were, I was thinking something wrong. But then eventually I think, the truth was so much on our side, it had to be said. So the way to influence right now, I think, is like this. We must focus on creating these centers of thought and research and education, which is going to create the next generation of scholar teachers, and as people are saying, not just scholar teachers, but scholar practitioners. We need Hinduism's professors in America to start with, at least a few dozen in the next decade or so, who will be unafraid to get onto the TV news and, just say, yes, no, Hinduism, the laws of Manu doesn't say that, you must go to the jungle or, to do bathroom. You know what I'm referring to, right? So the New York Times had an obnoxious article a couple of months ago where they say that, this sanitation problem in India exists because the laws of Manu dictates that Hindus don't use toilets. Bizarre. Now, unfortunately, there are, I'm sure, hundreds of Hinduism professors in the US and maybe 10 or 20 on our side out of these hundreds. But nobody can, go out there and speak out. By contrast, the cartoonist office is attacked in Paris. Whatever act of terrorism takes place, immediately there are all these public intellectuals or in the media saying this is an aberration, terrorism is not part of Islam, so on and so forth. So I'm happy, I'm glad they're having the debate and trying to encourage the non-violent interpretations of their philosophy. We need more of that, I'm happy for that. But we are the only community which are denounced by its supposed professors. So I think the thing to do is focus. We built a lot of temples, I'm glad, in America. Now let's focus on building, one or two centers, where, good PhD scholars will be turned out in close interaction with scholars in India and, maybe even in Southeast Asia, and just restore Dharma. And we can do it. Start in academia, it will follow.
Good evening, my name is Srinivasan. This is a very specific question because this usually comes up with the proselytizers and the commie secular crowd. The easiest way to attack Hinduism is to talk about the status of Dalits. And then with that, they just push everything under the carpet and say, this fraudulent proselytization is fine, putting down the Modi government is fine, etc., etc. So how, I don't want a comprehensive answer, but how do we handle this? Because the government has been doing a lot on affirmative action. Whatever the historical stuff, we believe that in terms of affirmative action, a lot has been done. Yesterday, after the BJP meet, they've announced that they are getting BJP party workers to meet every family which is engaged in manual scavenging to get out of it and find other ways of employment. Amongst that is, many of them have come up. You have the Pobargades who don't need reservation, and you have my mate's children who need reservation but they don't get it. It's a very complex problem, but till we solve the problem, we need to address this publicly. So how do we take a stance on that?
No, that's one. I think in terms of policy, obviously, one of the incredible things that has happened is there has been such strong support from everything I understand from the new government for inclusiveness towards Dalits. And at my book launch in Delhi, for example, Mr. Tarun Vijay was so eloquent in simply just saying we need to get over whatever traces of prejudice and inhibitions we have as a people about caste. That is one of the things. When earlier I said we have to pick what we want to keep and what we want to change about Hinduism. I obviously don't believe that this was the intrinsic part of our philosophy for thousands of years and things like that. But it has become a part of our way of living for several hundred years at least, probably in response to these external imperial pressures to a large part. Whatever it is, I think one of the big changes that is taking place generationally is for us to get over these attitudes. So one way we can do it, I don't know much about the policies, but I'll speak about attitudes and the narratives about as far as Dalit perceptions and things like that go. We need to do our homework in terms of where many of our narratives and stories and beliefs about the world come from. That's kind of what we do in media studies. That's kind of what, the critics of Indology are doing brilliantly now. To tell you the truth, I didn't know until, very recently how deeply, the so-called secular social sciences were just watered down Christian mythology about the pagans, right? That has been done brilliantly. Now, in the similar way, I think we also need better critiques about where our popular casteist ideas have come from in the last 100 years or so. For example, I remember when we were young, a lot of people would talk about, genetic supremacy of, some castes or backwardness of some castes, things like that. Now in retrospect, I realize, now that I have the tools for this is, all stuff that came from colonialism. And many ways I think the casteist attitudes of many Indians were really colonial racist attitudes indigenized. And we don't talk about that. We also, the liberals among us just say, oh yeah, this is how we've always been, and some of us just say, no, we are really superior to some people. And as Dr. Swami said at my book launch, I'm just quoting this because it was such a wonderful conversation, and well, my publisher has yet to upload it. I want to share it with you. he said something so beautiful. He said, you know, this is the only country where you just look around in a room, you see so much diversity, right? I mean, it has nothing to this whole caste race equation is a Western myth, you know. So that way I think we need to do a self-archaeology of our social stereotypes and myths and break them apart and just understand that our prejudices too are a part of colonialism. And once we decolonize ourselves, I think we'll arrive at more humane, egalitarian, kind Hindu ways of knowing each other, regardless of, you know, our identity labels. Now, in terms of affirmative action, things like that, there are a couple of, you know, quick strategies I mentioned in the book. See, one of Wendy Doniger's claims in the book is about how she's, you know, rescuing these Dalit subaltern narratives of Hinduism, and she talks about dead white Brahmin, no, not whatever, you know, what did she call it? Dead Brahmin males, you know, like, you know, like dead white males was a phrase for Eurocentrism. So she's in all the time, you know, making bad puns about something called dead Brahmin males. And I said, oh, which dead Brahmin male are you decolonizing? Vyasa, Valmiki? Okay, yeah, those guys, big Brahmins they were, right, you know. I mean, we are a country whose gods were not Brahmins. I mean, the big Arist avatars were not Brahmins. I mean, you know, half the Brahmins you see are pretty poor, you know, and okay, so this is a reality that's in our face. I mean, our reality is the greatest source of the new social sciences that's going to emerge. You know, just observe things with a cool heart and mind, and I think we're going to see, you know, things very, very differently from the schizophrenia that we've been afflicted with. So I think as far as the, you know, the inclusiveness about the Dalit experience and perspective, you know, Amit was talking about earlier, but, you know, we were talking before about, you know, the Ambedkar critiques, which have been very selectively used by the left, from what we can see. So there's, I think, a lot more work that can be done, and we will, you know, we will not lose any part of ourselves. That's all I can say.
We'll take last two
Hello,
questions, one right at the back and one here with the lady.
Yeah, this is Manohar here. Yeah, going back to the previous point you made about finding centers of excellence in the university academia. So there are two sources of funding. One is the Indian government, which has given a lot of money to find some shares in the Chicago University and many other places, and the Indian private companies like Infosys, Mahindra, Tata, who have given a lot of money. This has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. So do you think it is just about finding the right people to lead these initiatives, and what has been the experience with these initiatives in the last few years?
Okay, good. Quick question, I can give you a quick answer. So from what I understand, one of the challenges has been that I can't speak about the specifics of these, which donation was went there, but one general perception I'm feeling in the Indian community is a lot of these efforts were misplaced, or at least counterproductive. Because, you know, they're led by two things. One, sometimes they're led by good intentions, sometimes they're led by the donors, you know, vanity or a desire to associate with some big name like Harvard or Chicago perhaps. And then what happens is, you know, academic, you know, politics, idiosyncrasies are very, very difficult. You know, I mean, very complicated. So what happens is, even if, say, a donor decides to fund a chair in a university, it's very difficult to, you know, have a say on, you know, who should get hired. I'm not saying that we should micromanage and, you know, say, oh yeah, you have to hire. That would not be professional for donors to do that. But, you know, obviously the expectation is if you given money for a chair in Hinduism studies, you would expect somebody who likes Hinduism, right? Which doesn't seem to be happening. So I think the new efforts, you know, which the Dharma Civilization Foundation has been trying to do, and which I'm, you know, totally, you know, very excited about, is to focus our efforts on one place. So for example, you know, there's a lot of excitement right now about trying to do something in Berkeley, not university, but another place in Berkeley, so that when we build a place from the beginning, you know, we can tap on these 20 or 30 scholars out of 2,000, you know, anti-Hindu scholars, and maybe build something really new, really innovative, and then it will grow from there. So hopefully, you know, the government, you know, the industrialists, and the community, and the Sampradayas, you know, the actual temples, you know, the Tirumala, Tirupati Devasthanam, the Matams, you know, the Satya Sai Baba organization, I'm in Bangalore, I must respectfully invoke Sri Ravi Shankar's organization. these are the great leaders, the modern and the traditional spiritual figures of our time. I think if they all come together and do this, it can happen.
Anuradha from the Development Foundation. Just a small comment on the question that was asked of why don't we have our own voice? And I'm just trying to think aloud on that. And could it be because we don't have any academically substantiated, unified identity, Hindu identity that has been defined? Whereas all these other groups seem to have a common identity that they've been able to define and therefore defend. In ours, because of our diversity, one says something, the other will say just the opposite. So which voice, who's going to defend what? That could be maybe one thing, but and therefore, like let's say in India, when we have the media which is constantly jumping at our throat at every little sentence that is passed by somebody, and we know that, I mean, even common people can see the stupidity of the media's anxiety, angst about these comments. So why is it that we are not able to create a media voice which can just stand for every question that is asked? We have our own response to that with equal strength, so that at least the public has a second, or I mean, has an alternative to think about. What's preventing that from coming into our media? Or how can we do it? Do we need to include these courses into our media studies?
Wow. I think what you said first of all is very, very perceptive. I mean, this is a key issue of existential crisis and uncertainty that you touched upon. Now here's the other crazy thing, so you said it so right, schizophrenia. We are doing a symptomology of schizophrenia here, and hypocrisy. Now, the other crazy thing, now we are the only community whose so-called experts like to trash us. Now here's the other absurdity. Now here's a scholarly consensus on Hinduism in academia apparently. It is exactly what you said in the first part of your question. Officially, academia is loath to admit that there is such a thing as Hinduism. Okay? And by the way, again, I'm just sharing all these conversations because this brotherhood, this this friendship, across the country can be known. I was in conversation with the author Ramesh, the immortal Shiva writer. Wonderful conversation we had in Mumbai, and his jaw dropped when I told him that according to academic scholars of Hinduism, Hinduism doesn't exist. He was stunned, and now that's the absurdity. So academia believes, and that is the canonical institutionalized view, that the word Hinduism, I mean, all this is just an invention. And we were all very different, we had nothing in common, or as Wendy Doniger says in her book, we had very little in common. There was somebody who nitpicked, and I said, Doniger says we had nothing in common. Somebody came to argue with me on the comment board and said, oh, you are saying that, she didn't say they have nothing in common, she said they had very little in common. So that is the level at which they are responding. So in a way, truth is on our side, brains are on our side, thank God. So anyway, here's the absurdity. They say we don't exist, Hinduism doesn't exist, it was all concocted and invented by Hindu nationalist supremacists like Swami Vivekananda, that supremacist, right, in the last 100 years. But they're also equally adamant in saying that, caste system and, gender discrimination and sati and every social evil they can think of or imagine is coterminous with Hinduism for thousands of years. So as I asked in my book, which one is it? So that's what we should all keep saying, which I wish we should all, wear these t-shirts or caps just saying which one is it, and with the covers of all these famous, historians, so-called historians. Now the second part, and kind of to flow with the first part, can we have a unified voice? Now it is going to be challenging for us because that is our strength, our diversity, our pluralism, all these nice phrases they use these days to educate us and secularize us. That's what we are. We are the original, diverse, plural people. We don't need terms like that or secularism, to just be who we are. So in many ways, we are going to continue to speak in many voices. That's fine. But again, at the risk of just sounding unacademic and poetic, we are starting to speak from one heart. And that's what is happening. And it's a deeply Hindu sensibility that I see coalescing right now. That's very important. Now, as far as the media goes, again, that is a big challenge. That is a big challenge. What are we to do? I keep hearing so many NRIs, saying things like, why don't we have our own Al Jazeera or BBC and things like that? I think we have the talent to do it. I mean, it's the same thing. Every time I come home, every airline, every plane is full of Indians going home. Whether it's a Chinese airline or a European airline or a Middle Eastern airline. And how come, we don't have one excellent airline which is so well developed, or even a bunch of Indian airlines where all the Indians in the diaspora can use instead of giving our money to other countries. So similarly, I don't know, we have Indian journalists and experts in virtually every media organization on earth. We just don't have one good thing on our own. I don't know, maybe by the time the second term comes, I'm taking the long view. I'm hoping that the second term is when we'll see the second term. Sounds good, when the Renaissance will move into reality. And it has to happen because it's going to happen. It has to happen in the media, in education, in higher education, in schools. And one thing I just want to respectfully suggest: the alternative discourse that we are creating, the alternative media, these are all wonderful things. But always remember that we cannot. Intellectual games, intellectual changes, changing narratives are not going to take place in a vacuum because these guys are not going to vanish. They've had the infrastructure both physically and culturally for several centuries. So at some point what is going to happen is, as I said, they're going to feel so horrible in their own little bubbles, they'll start coming up for air. And then we'll be kind, compassionate, forgiving, Hindu about it, and we'll just kind of let these borders dissolve. So in other words, we'll go mainstream with our story, and they will take us the second term.
Sincere thanks.
Sincere thanks to Professor Jaluri for taking our questions, and I'm sure you might have more to talk, so we can do it offline after the meeting. The biggest takeaway for us, the people who are not in academia, like the people who are organizing this from Jigyasa and others, is to strictly think about his key suggestion. If you have more than one kid, you know where to send the second kid to, right? So please keep that in mind. With that being said, my sincere thanks to KV Sharma, to KP Ganesh, to Vinay, to Manohar, to all the people who have helped make this event. And last but not the least, I would like to call upon our friend Mr. Vishwanath Pai to come here for a Vande Mataram recitation. He sings really well from deep inside his heart. So I request everybody to stand up and please respect Vande Mataram, and after that we disperse. And before we forget, the books are on that side, and any donations you want to make, you can make. So over to Mr. Pai.
Vande Mataram Sujalam Sufalam Malayaj Sheetalam Sasya Shamalam Mataram Vande Mataram Shubhra Josna Pulakitayamini Pulla Kusumita Drumadala Shobini Suhasini Sumadura Bhashini Sukadam Varadam Mataram Vande Mataram Koti Koti Kanta Kala Kala Ninada Karale Koti Koti Bhujai Dhrita Kara Karavale Abala Keno Mae Dobale Bahubala Darini Namami Tarini रिपुदलवारिणीं मातरम् वन्दे मातरम्। तुम्ही विद्या तुम्ही धर्म तुम्ही हृदय तुम्ही मर्म तुम्ही प्राण शरीरे बाहुते तुम्ही महाशक्ती हृदये तुम्ही महाभक्ती तोमारई प्रतिमागडी मंदिरे मंदिरे वंदे मातरम्। त्वमि दुर्गा दश प्रहरणधारिणी कमला कमलदल विहारिणी वाणी विद्यादायिनी नमामि त्वां नमामि कमलाम् अमलां मथुरां सुजलां सुफलां मातरम् वन्दे मातरम्। श्यामलां सरलां सुष्मितां भूषितां धरणीं भरणीं मातरम् वन्दे मातरम्। बोलो भारत माता की जय।
You got it? For the report.